It's really a pleasure to be here. As you could tell from my bio, I am a social scientist, and since I gather I may be one of the first, if not the first social scientist to participate in this program, I thought I would kind of give you a broad synthesis talk of how social scientists really think about how do we communicate issues like climate change to the public or policymakers. And just to give you a little context about the type of research I do, I'm very broadly interested in how does the public perceive and engage in climate and energy issues. And I answer this question in a number of different ways. So this picture here is sort of representing how do people respond to different descriptions of the problem of climate change? How does that either increase or decrease their motivation or support for climate mitigation efforts? If we want to reduce climate emissions, we also have to think about different types of energy technologies. So some of the work I do looks at public perceptions of renewable energy technology, hydraulic fracturing, and as you'll see, I've also done some work on geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal technologies. So those are sort of the big picture. When you're communicating an issue, how are people responding? Some of the other work I do, which I won't talk about today, is how do you get individuals and households to make lifestyle choices that reduce energy in their home or encourage them to put rooftop solar on their homes. What I want to focus on today is this big picture of how do you communicate about a problem like climate change. We have a preponderance of evidence that the global average temperature is increasing. We predict weather patterns are going to change. It's going to disrupt our way of life and cause a lot of damage with more severe storms, as many of you already know. The question is, how do we then engage society in taking action on this issue? And there are a lot of different stakeholders we need to consider. Our citizens, our business and industry leaders, our political leaders. I'm very sorry about this guy. And it's very tempting when you have this type of issue, you think about the scientists who create these maps, well, how do we convey this information to these groups? And it's tempting to think, well, we need to provide them with more information. And there is this theory in communication science called information deficit model. It's very pervasive, and it basically says that the difference between you as a scientist and a non-scientist is one of information. You have more information available to you, you've gone through this education. So clearly, under this theory, what follows from this is the idea that we should just educate people and try to equip people with better information. This is a really appealing idea. It seems intuitive. If you think about how you came to care about different environmental problems, it was because you were educated about them. And as part of this theory, the assumption is that once you inform people, they will become knowledgeable. Once someone is knowledgeable about an issue, they will be aware of that environmental problem. They will form attitudes that are supportive of taking action on it. And because of those attitudes, they will change their behavior in some way. So you can imagine with someone in the public, the idea is they learn about climate change, they become concerned about it, maybe they take actions in their home to use less energy. Same idea with a policymaker, they become concerned and then are motivated to support some sort of policy to take action. Unfortunately, 30 to 40 years of empirical research shows that this model does not work. Information is very rarely sufficient to change behavior. And in some cases, it's not even necessary. You can sometimes get people to change their behavior without first telling them about an environmental issue. So what I want to do today is sort of walk through why this model doesn't work. I know it's a very pervasive one, and at least from climate scientists that I've worked with, it's their natural tendency to think we just need to tell everybody about this issue. And what I will focus on today is sort of, this first link of why you can't expect that once someone has information, it will change how they think about a problem. There are also ways that it breaks down between attitudes and behavior. At least in English, we have this phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's very much the case here. There are all kinds of things where if you think about your own life, you probably care about something, have attitudes in a certain way, you know you should exercise more and eat healthy, but you don't actually act on it. So I'm going to focus on this first part, and I'll kind of walk through some principles or challenges of climate change communication that also very broadly apply to science communication. I'll take you through 2 studies that I've done that kind of help illustrate the challenges that we have, and in particular why the same message isn't received in the same way by different people. And then I'll wrap up by kind of going over some strategies for better communication. And what I hope that you'll come away with from the end of this is that the way we talk about environmental issues like climate change, or the way we talk about its solutions, is truly just as important as the underlying science itself. I should say I will save time at the end for questions, but by all means, if you have a clarifying question, please feel free to ask it in the middle. So what are some of the challenges of climate change communication, or science communication in general? Well, part of the problem is us. If you are an expert, you can be blinded by your own expertise. If you think about the knowledge that you've gained about atmospheric sciences, or whatever the case may be, you've acquired that information through time, maybe through years of training. And what happens each time as you're exposed to information, the neurons in your brain have these connections, and each time you have repeat exposure of an idea, those neurons become more tightly connected. And what happens after you've had lots of experience and exposure is that you come to think about the things on which you're an expert almost intuitively. It's very different for someone who is new to a topic. Their mental models are more diffuse and not as tightly connected. To give you an example not related to the environment, you can think about a medical doctor who maybe has 10 years of experience versus a medical student who's had a couple years of schooling. So imagine those 2 people come into a room with a patient. That medical doctor will listen to the symptoms and have probably an intuitive sense of the 1 or 2 things that they might diagnose that person with. The student probably has to think more carefully about what they've learned. It's not as intuitive for them to come up with an answer or a diagnosis. So the challenge is that when you are an expertise and you think intuitively about whatever you're an expert on, you forget what it's like to be new to an issue. And that can distort your sense of what information is most important for me to communicate to the public or to a policymaker, because you have this rich map and all these little details and nuances about an issue, and you're going to want to try to share all of that at once, and really that can tend to overwhelm people. And this is further complicated because the audiences that we are communicating with have limited attention. If we want people to support action on climate change or take action in their own lives, obviously they need to pay attention to information about it. But it turns out that our attention is very selective and scarce. We're actually only actively attending to a small fraction of the information that's available to you. So I imagine many of you talked with each other before you came into the room. Do you know what color shirt the person was wearing? Or the color of their shoes or their pants? Were they wearing a watch? That information was technically available to you when you stood in front of them, but you weren't actively attending it. And that's something that we kind of, when we're excited and passionate about a topic, we tend to forget that this thing that matters a lot to us may not catch the attention of the audiences we're trying to speak to. So if you imagine websites or newspapers, we may have information out there about climate change or whatever the issue may be, but it may not catch attention as much as we expect it to. And frankly, climate change is something that seems less relevant to most people, so it's easy for it to fall into the background and not be noticed. Even when people are trying to pay attention, their ability to focus is limited by something in psychology that we call working memory. I can hear the Spanish catching up, so I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast. So working memory is basically, it's like the random access memory, the RAM of your computer, the temporary storage as your computer is chugging through information. And it's kind of like a juggling act. Psychologists have determined that we can only consciously switch our mind back and forth between sort of 4 chunks of information, or 4 kind of ideas. So to give you an example, you are using a chunk of information to remember, what is this talk broadly about? It's about communicating climate change. You're using another chunk of information to understand what I'm saying about attention. And maybe you're using some other chunks thinking about whatever research you need to do later today. So you can have some intrusive thoughts as well. And you can only really kind of bounce back and forth between 4 of these ideas. This is where expertise gets us into trouble as well. Because of those really tightly connected mental models that you have, you can cram a whole lot more information into a single chunk than a novice can on that same topic. In other words, if you're new to something, it takes more of your working memory to make sense of it than it does for an expert. This is probably something that you have all experienced. Maybe you've taken a class and had a professor who went way too quickly through the information, and it was hard for you to keep up. That's a difference in expertise, and that professor being able to think about much more than you can at the same time. So the consequences of this are that we can very easily overwhelm people without meaning to, or even to be aware of it. We can give too much information and outpace our audience's ability to keep up. The other challenge is we're competing with whatever else is going on in our audience's lives. So if we're trying to convey climate change or some other environmental topic, it's competing for their attention with, worrying about your family and work and keeping up with friends on social media. Complicating this further is just the problem of climate change itself. From a psychological perspective, climate change is not something that is easy for people to wrap their heads around. It is a very complex, abstract problem, and it appears to be happening slowly from the perspective of everyday people. This means it's not very personally relatable. The impacts are diffuse. They occur in geographically remote places. I think one of the biggest problems is that you cannot personally experience the cause and effect of climate change. When you think about how you use energy and fossil fuels, you're using them to do things that bring benefits to your life. So you want to get from A to B, you're using gasoline in your car. You're experiencing the pleasure of using fossil fuels, or having electricity and lights in your home, getting to use your computer. These are all things that bring convenience and comfort. We don't actually see the greenhouse gas emissions that come from burning those fossil fuels. And because of all these issues or attributes of climate change, this problem can seem to be of low importance relative to other things that are very present in your day-to-day. So this can be true when you think about the policy landscape. Climate change can seem less important than health issues or the economy. And even for people who care about climate change, in their day-to-day lives, it's very easy to forget about this problem in the background. Unfortunately, a lot of early communications kind of magnified this issue, and I wish I could say more about how things have happened here in Mexico. Most of the research on climate change communication is done in the US or the UK or Australia. And a lot of those communications, I would say in the early 2000s, had these types of images. The earth is on fire, look at this poor polar bear. They did a lot of things to stress the urgency of the problem. I would say Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth also really added a lot to that. And on the one hand, this urgency momentarily got people really concerned. It was good at capturing their attention, but it actually made the problem seem overwhelming. What can I personally do to help this polar bear? Not a whole lot. And even as an individual, it's very hard for you to fathom, what can I do that's going to help resolve a whole global issue? So what happens is it's very easy for people to disengage from this issue and to kind of come away thinking this is for somebody else to figure out. It's for the scientists to figure out, for the policymakers. I will admit, even as a researcher in this space, I don't click on as many climate change news articles as I used to because it's kind of overwhelming and depressing. And I would say one of the biggest challenges of trying to communicate climate change or even other environmental issues is that the information people are receiving is very heavily filtered. So this goes back directly to why that information deficit model is not correct. People are not blank slates or empty vessels. You can't take what's in your head and expect to directly put it in theirs. So please, if you wrote any notes about information deficit model, cross it out. It's a bad model. Instead, what's happening is people are filtering that information using the mental models that they already have. So they're deciding what to do with that information based on their past knowledge, their beliefs, their values, their experiences. And this can take many different forms. In the US, a lot of the research focuses on political ideology. As you may be aware, Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservatives, are very divided on climate change. They have different ideological beliefs that make them see that issue differently, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. It can also come down to religious beliefs. So depending on your faith, you may have different perspectives on is it really possible for humans to cause a problem like this? That seems like that's something only God could do. This relates also to how people think about how humans relate to nature. Some people very much value the environment and the biosphere in and of itself, and therefore will be more protective. Other people think it's humans' right to sort of control the earth. And so depending on which camp you're in, you're going to perceive climate change differently. Similarly, if you have certain beliefs about human ingenuity will save us. We'll come up with the right technology that can frame how you think about the issue. And then even things like your day-to-day experience. And this is probably one of the most frustrating aspects for climate change communicators. People, especially people who aren't sure what to think about climate change, are very swayed by the weather. So if you're someone who already believes in climate change, you will look at droughts or very severe storms as evidence climate change is definitely happening. I know in the US, if you are a political conservative, every time we have a massive snowstorm, this gives them an excuse to say global warming isn't happening. So this type of personal experience can have a large effect, and I think some people, it goes back to that idea of cause and effect. They think that they should be able to directly see climate change happening, and so if what's happening around them doesn't match that, they're going to be more likely to dismiss it. So these pre-existing beliefs and values that people have can shape your perception of many different facets of the issue. It can influence whether, we were just having a conversation earlier, whether you believe in the reality of climate change. Is it possible that humans are causing this? It can affect your sense of urgency or the perceived risk of the problem. It can also shape how acceptable you find different solutions. And I'll give you some examples in a minute of how, at least in the US, political conservatives are really against different solutions to climate change. It can also shape your perception of who's responsible for taking action, as well as who's the messenger of the communication. Depending on the beliefs and values you have, you may be very quick to dismiss a climate change message from one type of messenger versus the other. The other challenge of filtering information like this is that people tend to engage in something we call motivated reasoning. And this basically means you're really protective of what you already believe. And so if you get information that challenges what you believe, you'll be really quick to dismiss it. And you will seek out information that supports your stance. We do this all the time on all kinds of issues. If I'm having a debate with my husband about something in the world, and he has one perspective and I have another, the first thing I do is go to Google and search for the thing that I believe is true. I should also search for what he thinks is true. So that's really what motivated reasoning is. I look for evidence that confirms what I already believe, and as soon as I get it, I'm convinced that I was right all along. So, let me give you some examples of how these filters can pan out. And I'm sorry that this is so sort of US focused, but this really is where most of the research is. So they have found that among Americans, liberals and conservatives are guided by what we call different moral foundations. So what feels morally right and what they care about morally is different between these groups. Liberals, as you might guess, tend to be more egalitarian. They care about fairness, about kindness, about not causing harm. Conservatives can care about those things too, but they tend to care more about in-group loyalty, respecting authority, and keeping with tradition. So if you try to think about how this shapes these two groups' perceptions of climate change, liberals are going to come away saying, well, yeah, climate change is a threat. It's going to hurt people. It's going to hurt the environment. It's going to hurt animals. And we have a responsibility as a human race to do something about it. Conservatives come at this in a very different way. For them, the idea that using fossil fuels through a free market is a bad thing. It really violates sort of their free market ideology. So it actually becomes easy for them to deny that climate change could be a problem. It really threatens their idea of the status quo. And what they find more threatening are what the liberals propose as solutions. So that they really dislike ideas of we have to use less or sacrifice. They want to see things that take advantage of the free market. And again, a lot of what gets proposed for mitigating climate change has this level of government intervention, which conservatives are very opposed to. We can also think more broadly about just different values that people have, and there's some nice work by Schwartz identifying these different types of value sets. So one value set is caring about the environment for the environment itself. There's another value set that's kind of pro-social, altruistic, caring about people. There are values about being open to change, and there are also sort of more self-interested, what we call egoistic values, where you care more about yourself. And there's a very popular theory within my field that people may be motivated to act on environmental issues if they feel that the things they value are in danger. So for someone who is more biospheric and altruistic, again, they're going to see climate change as a threat because it threatens the environment and it threatens people. These tend to be different people than people who score highly on this sort of self-serving, self-interested value set. These people might be motivated to act if you can frame climate change in terms of impacts on health, the comfort of their family, so really immediate self-interest. I think also damage to your home or property. So if you live in a place that's prone to flooding, maybe a message around that could be motivating. We're seeing in the business community, you can kind of appeal to this value by talking about how it affects your bottom line or the local economy. So I used to live in the state of Michigan in the United States. It is, if you ever meet someone from Michigan, they will put up their hand because the state is shaped like your hand. And the top part of the state is where there's a lot of tourism. This is the Great Lakes go around Michigan. So we have a lot of coastal area, a lot of beaches. And scientists have been able to kind of make a compelling case that climate change really threatens this whole tourism industry. But you can see, though, that for someone who's more on this side and cares about these things, talking about climate change in this way isn't going to get very far. So these are just a few examples. If we kind of step back and think about these different challenges and what they imply, if we know that most people are not very well informed on this issue, and they're probably not motivated to sit down and really study it and weigh all of the evidence, and if we also know that they have a limited attention and that they're going to filter any information coming in, the consensus among social scientists is that scientists really have to prioritize what information we communicate, and we have to frame it in a way that resonates with core values. Now, this is the type of statement that I've done some work with different climate modelers. They get really uncomfortable with this, because when is science ever value-laden? That's not to say that we need to shift away from the science, but we need to figure out how to match up science with things that people already care about. So there are a lot of different ways we can do this. One is to think about what are the climate change impacts that we're emphasizing? Who is going to be impacted? Which people, which animals, which types of actors, whether they're citizens, businesses. We see a lot of attention on impact on farmers. We can also talk about kind of the type of impacts. Is this just environmental, or is it a health impact? Is it going to change growing seasons for farmers? We can talk about impacts at different geographical scales as well as different time scales. So all of these can still fit within science, but it's a matter of sort of selecting which information we think is most important to the audience. We can also think about, and I realize maybe as a scientist you're less interested in this part, but thinking about framing who's responsible for the issue, who should act. We can also think about what are the different roles that people fill. Do people have a responsibility as parents or as grandparents to be supportive of climate change mitigation for the sake of their children or grandchildren? Something that's been successful in getting conservatives interested in climate change in the US is connecting it to their faith, and this idea that addressing climate change is part of your responsibility of taking care of God's creation. We can also think about what information we share in terms of what should be done, which energy technologies should we be deploying at scale, what are our different policy options, at what level of government, over what time period, and we can think about why. And this is probably a space too that as a scientist you're less comfortable in, but others, sort of advocates on climate change, think a lot about why should people act? We could try to frame messages around inaction violates your morals. A different take on this is to think about taking action is prudent. It ensures against risk, and it's better to take action and be proactive than to be reactive because we didn't. And we can also think about different ways or different benefits that come from climate change mitigation. So before I go on, are there any questions or clarifying things I can clarify? No, okay. So what I want to do is share kind of two examples of studies that I've done that really just illustrate how we can think that we're sending one message out to everybody, but people are perceiving it differently. So the first study looks at how you frame climate change impacts and how that affects support for mitigation policies. And then the second study is going to be about carbon dioxide removal, which if you're not familiar with, I'll explain, but how learning about a possible technological solution can change your perceptions of the problem of climate change itself. So in this first study, we really wanted to see how can we get political conservatives more engaged in this issue. And there have been sort of two popular hypotheses that come up in my field of research, and one is that instead of focusing on mitigation, which we know conservatives don't like, maybe we focus on adaptation, and that will get them interested and maybe be a backdoor to mitigation. So that's one strategy to test. The other is to talk about to vary whether the impacts are happening in a remote place or try to bring it down to a local level that people might be familiar with. So in this study, we're testing whether we talk about mitigation or adaptation, and whether we're talking about climate change impacts that happen in Europe, which the shorthand here is global, or impacts that happen in what we call the Midwest. So it's kind of a local, regional frame. So both of the studies I'm going to present, we take a similar approach. We do online surveys with about 1,000 people, and we try to balance who's in that survey population to match the age, gender, and education distributions in the US. And for this study, we specifically recruited half of our sample live in this red zone, and the other half live outside of it. And within each of those groups, we randomly assigned them to read a fake news article that was either about climate change impacts in Europe and what cities in Europe are doing to mitigate it, or those impacts and what cities are doing to adapt. Or the other two conditions talked about those same impacts happening in the Midwest and what cities are doing to either mitigate or adapt. And one of the things that we've learned from climate change communication is that talking about health impacts tends to be very effective. So that's, in all the conditions, there was a strong health emphasis. So, this slide, this is what the experimental treatment was. It's just 3 paragraphs. This is the global frame, and the purple highlighting represents the words that changed between the global and the local. So this is almost identical, except that it's saying United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change versus the US Environmental Protection Agency. It talks about consequences of climate change around the globe, worldwide, versus the Midwest and local communities. And then it talks about what cities in Paris and Southern Europe are doing versus Chicago, where I'm from, and the Great Lakes region. And the same thing at the bottom. So the impacts that are being described are exactly the same. It's just a matter of, is this in a faraway place or somewhere in the US? And then for mitigation and adaptation, we tried to, again, keep this similar. It's a little harder to do here. But the mitigation frame talked about what cities are doing to mitigate. So talking about renewable energy sources, providing public transportation, creating more high-efficiency buildings. And the adaptation frame talked about having early warning systems for severe weather events, preparations for heat waves, and flooding. So these are pretty subtle differences. And what we did after people read the story, we asked them to rate on survey scales how relevant the story was, how interesting, how worried they were, how hopeful. We want to see, does this story kind of speak to them in a way that the typical way climate change is framed might not? We had a number of measures about sort of their engagement. Did they want to learn more about the issue? Did they themselves feel motivated to take action? Do they want their community to act? And then we had them rate how supportive they would be of their local government taking action. So if we look at everyone across the entire sample, we find that the adaptation framings made people more worried. And in open-ended comments, people said, well, these are good things to do, but I really hope we'll do more to prevent the problem as well. So there's maybe a little bit of evidence that adaptation is good at getting people more worried about the problem. And as you might expect, we also found that those Midwest framings were perceived as more relevant to people in the US than those European frames. We didn't find any differences, though, in terms of their engagement or their support for local action. But, as I've said many times already, we obviously have very different political ideologies within the US. And so we looked at how do Democrats and Republicans respond differently to these stories. So if we look at how worried they were after reading the article, these are very liberal people. This blue line is adaptation, this orange line is mitigation. So these are the people who read global mitigation, global adaptation, local mitigation, local adaptation. For very liberal people, it doesn't matter which story you read, your level of worry afterwards is the same. If we look at people who are politically moderate, their worry is a little bit lower, but again, there are no differences between the 4 conditions. So what about our conservatives, the people we're really trying to reach in the first place? This is actually where we start to see differences. So the first thing to notice is that the global adaptation, learning about what cities like Paris and Copenhagen are doing to adapt to climate change, made them more worried than learning about what those same cities were doing to mitigate. And we also found that reading about local mitigation made them more worried than reading about global mitigation. So there's a little bit of evidence that this local frame is better. Between the two local conditions, it didn't matter if you talked about adaptation or mitigation. So we see this same pattern across multiple measures. So their interest in the article, their engagement, how much they wanted to learn more, and how much they wanted their community to act, this same pattern emerged, whereas there really wasn't a difference for moderates and liberals. So what's going on here? If you look at liberals, basically it doesn't matter. All of the stories have the same effect, which probably reflects that they're already concerned about this issue. But conservatives, that global mitigation frame is what performed the worst, and that's probably most similar to what people hear in the news. Climate change is going to have this horrible impact on all these far-off places. So this, in their mind, is the same old story. I'm not excited about this. I'm not worried about this. But if you start to frame the message around what might happen to recognizable places in the US, actually, it moves the needle. They're more worried, they're more engaged. And interestingly, we see that adaptation frame in the European setting actually kind of piqued their interest. And it could just be, that the novelty of that kind of grabbed their attention and may have increased the salience of risk. So this study kind of gives you an example of one size does not fit all. In some ways, you can use any of these things and you'll be fine with liberals. They already care, but it may matter a lot how we decide to talk about this issue for people who are less convinced that it's a problem. The second study I want to share talks about or looks at what happens when we start to come up with new solutions to climate change. Do we have to worry that people will be less engaged in the issue because it seems like those smart scientists figured it out? So this study looks at carbon dioxide removal and or CDR, as it's abbreviated. The basic idea of carbon dioxide removal is that you're going to remove existing CO2 from the atmosphere so that you create negative emissions. And there are many different types of carbon dioxide removal strategies. With all of them, you're taking that CO2 and sequestering it for a long time. There are three types of CDR that get talked about the most. One of these is direct air capture, where the idea is to have these industrial fans that are as big as this building pull air through, and through chemical reactions remove the CO2, and then it will get stored through carbon capture and storage deep underground. There's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and in this strategy, you're growing crops that can then be burned. You get energy, you capture the CO2 from burning it, and again, use carbon capture and storage. Or you can do reforestation, but this is planting areas of land that are the size of the size of Texas. So it's massive reforestation, and in this case, obviously the CO2 is being stored in the trees. So we were interested in understanding how does this change people's perception of the issue? And carbon dioxide removal started to get a lot of attention in the news about 2 years ago as it became apparent that we're not going to meet our targets for the Paris Climate Accord. One possibility when you tell people about these technologies is that it's going to decrease the perceived threat of climate change. The problem's going to seem solved. We've figured out a way to pull out the CO2. All is good. So this could create a moral hazard where people think we no longer have to do other types of mitigation, and we don't have to worry about burning fossil fuels. The alternative outcome is that by virtue of needing this type of crazy technology, it's going to heighten the perceived risk of climate change because it should signal, oh my gosh, this problem is a lot more severe than I thought it was, that we now have to do this. So this could increase perceived risk. So we wanted to understand how learning about these different technologies affected perceived threat of climate change, and then in turn see how that affects whether they support traditional mitigation policies, like energy efficiency or renewable energy. And the way we did this is again a survey experiment. We had about 1,000 people, and we randomly assigned them to read one of 5 news stories. Our control group was a very simple paragraph description of climate change. And then other people were assigned to read about reforestation, about BECCS, as we call it, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture. And then there was also a condition that described carbon dioxide removal in really general terms. It didn't mention any of these by name. It was just kind of conveying what is the idea of carbon dioxide removal. And just to give you, I'm getting ahead of myself. So after people read about one of these, they then rated the perceived threat of climate change and their support for different types of mitigation policies. And to give you a sense, this is again a really simple intervention. It's 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is basically, how does this strategy work? And the second paragraph is, how effective do we think it's going to be? And what are some of the potential considerations? So for reforestation, you need massive amounts of land. So in this case, reforestation can store up to 15% of carbon dioxide emissions, but you need a lot of land, and that could conflict with other human uses. Similar thing with BECCS. We kind of talked about its effectiveness. Again, talk about land competition. And then direct air capture, again, talk about its effectiveness, and then note that you need a lot of energy to have a direct air capture facility, which means you got to have land for solar or wind. So looking at this question of how does this change the perceived threat of climate change, we found that in these 3 boxes, learning about BECCS or direct air capture or CDR in general, it actually decreased the perceived threat of climate change. So people are thinking, oh, this sounds effective, I don't have to be as worried about it. Reforestation had no effect on this outcome. And then as a result of decreased perceived threat, people who were assigned to these conditions, it led them to be less supportive of traditional mitigation policies. What I didn't mention is that we also looked at political ideology, and this pattern was much stronger among conservatives. So if you try to think about why that would be the case, well, this fits their worldview and free market ideology. Cool, we can have technologies that will solve this problem, and now I don't have to sacrifice. So this is one of those cases where if we're thoughtful about how we're framing solutions, we can actually get more people on board. The downside is it made them less supportive of other mitigation policies. So looking across these 2 studies, this is all to say that there's no guarantee that what we communicate to people is going to be perceived the way we intend it to. People are going to come away with it with different perspectives, and even something as short as a couple paragraphs can alter their perceptions. The audience matters. One size fits all. One size does not fit all. Sorry. And we have to be really careful when we're introducing new energy technologies or describing a problem. One of the reasons that motivated that carbon dioxide removal study is, gosh, there's not been a lot of talk about this in the news. if we're not careful in how we introduce this to the public, you're going to get lots of people on board with, well, just do that. I don't want to worry about using less energy or having to support renewable energy. So I wanted to end with some strategies for trying to improve communications. And I will caveat this first by saying we know a whole lot more about what doesn't work than what does. But there are some general things that we've come away with. One of these is we really have to know our audience and connect whatever scientific issue it is in a meaningful way to something that they care about. So trying to understand what motivates the audience, what are their underlying values or worldviews, what are other issues that they care about. So for example, I imagine with a lot of air pollution issues, asthma and kids' asthma could be something that really catches people's attention, far more so than if you frame the issue in terms of consequences to the environment. And I will say, sometimes this means letting go of why you care about an issue. I imagine a number of you got into the fields you're in because you care about different types of environmental issues. That may not be why someone else will care about them. And so you've really got to come at it from the audience's perspective. And I will say less is more. You've really got to resist the temptation to provide complete information to your audience. And I think this is something that tends to make scientists a little uncomfortable because there are simple ways of explaining things, but you know in the back of your mind that they're much more complicated and nuanced, and there's a desire to be precise. You gotta let that go. You will lose people, one, if you give them too much information. And the other thing, the second issue is people dislike uncertainty. So if they catch any whiff of there's uncertainty about this, or it's not always this way, they will probably suspend judgment and not get as engaged as if you said, well, most of the time this is the issue, and not go into all those little caveats or nuances. We also need to do a better job of making the issue concrete and tangible, breaking it down to a human scale, and how does this relate to everyday life? So we've seen some evidence, for example, in the first study, that localizing the issue can be very effective. I think we also need to do a better job of just incorporating people into how we describe it, getting away from, I see the appeal of, oh, clearly this is about environmental issues. But there's actually research showing that this makes people feel more disconnected, that it's not something that they should act on, and that it's for scientists to figure out. And same thing, with, I don't even know how I did that. Oh, that was bad. How fast can I go? We have to move away from these images of polar bears or even of people in far-off, distant places, because they're not things that people relate to. I went way too far. I had another study that I didn't share with you. One of these days. Okay. We got to move away from even showing these distant things and make it tangible by showing everyday people in it. The other strategy that both helps you simplify and make it concrete is to try to use stories and analogies. We are hardwired to think in terms of stories. If you think about our prehistoric ancestors and having cave paintings, we have a long history of communicating with each other through stories. It makes it much easier for people to remember. It's also more attention grabbing. And this is something I encourage you to look up. The Story of Stuff does these wonderful little videos. In this case, this is talking about microfibers that come off of clothing and how they end up in the water supply. This is actually something I make my students watch versus reading a fact sheet about microfibers. They remember so much more from this than they do of just giving the information you get in a fact sheet. And the last piece of advice is to think about, don't just communicate the problem, but give some hint of the solutions that are available and the efficacy of those different responses. Climate change tends to provoke feelings of fear, and that's one of those things where we have that fight or flight response. If we don't feel that we have an effective way to address it, we're going to just tune out the message and ignore it. So we have to try to pair information about the problem along with what can be done. But there's a caveat to this, and that is research has shown you have to not give people too much hope. Because, which I know is so sad, but if you give them too much hope, they will also decide the problem is fixed and I don't need to worry about it. So if you're interested in this, this is a little bit of a shameless plug. I have a chapter in this book, but I cited some other chapters that others wrote that get more at the psychology of climate change. There's also this really good book that's meant for journalists and science communicators that's free online about how to talk to people. And I'm sorry, these are all in English. There's a website called Climate Access that is very much dedicated toward helping people on the ground communicate more effectively. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain those.
¿Preguntas?
Thank you very much for your speech. I have maybe it's a silly question, but I remember 15 or 20 years ago there was a discussion about if the climate change will name climate change or global warming.
Oh, which way you talk about it?
And I can remember why it was named climate change, but there is something about in the global warming is some kind of guilty one, and maybe it's if we call global warming instead of climate change, we have to find something or someone that is warming the planet. I mean.
So the research I am familiar with suggests that global warming is a bad phrase to use because people who don't want to believe in it can use big snow events or weather that doesn't seem like warming as evidence that it's not happening. And so in the US, you will find actually that among conservative news sources, they will intentionally call it global warming. Whereas, as Trump would call it, the biased liberal news media will refer to it as climate change. And I think some people would say climate change is more accurate, even though, yes, average temperatures are increasing. So I think it's because people use their personal experience to refute that it's global warming.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have some comments and maybe then at the end some question. Personally, I'm very pessimistic if we're going to get people to personally address the issue. And I think really we have to address policymakers who are the ones that represent us and that have the power to put in effect, say, the carbon tax and so on. However, your presentation did not include a very large fraction of the problem to solve, or the component to solve the problem, which is the very large interest groups that exist. I don't know if you read recently, I think I read it on Sunday in the New York Times Magazine, that story about the decade that we almost got there.
I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
That's flagged.
But that highlights that scientists were not talking to the average person that cannot understand. They were talking to Congress, and it was the Hansen reports to Congress and so on in the late 80s that started that. And it got all the way to the President's Office of Science and Technology, and they got together in Europe, 7 big countries and so on. And of course, the interest groups of the fossil fuel industry, production industry, said no way.
Yep.
And the US backed out at that time, which was the 1990, I believe. So the reality is we need to engage that group. And that group will only get engaged if they see benefits economically.
Yep.
So you know, this is all very interesting, but there are some realities that we need to address that were not presented here, so maybe you can comment.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you, and would even add in addition to those interest groups, there are people who are paid to go online and write comments that are climate denialism, which just kind of, in the US, it helped create this idea of, do you believe in climate change? It sowed enough doubt. And
So only one additional question, it was a Republican president
yeah.
in charge also.
Yeah.
Almost got signed.
So you're starting to go into the political science space that starts to be less my area of expertise, but you're right. I mean, we're in general seeing this bigger divide between Republicans and Democrats on this issue that has happened over time. And I would say, I mean, part of this too is, given the way politicians are and worrying about being reelected, there is an argument for trying to engage people in this on a personal level, because that may actually make them more engaged at a political level. But this is a whole other topic in terms of how people vote and whatnot. So I completely see your point, but can't directly speak to it. But you're right, I kind of missed that other major player in this issue.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is, there is a tendency among scientists, well, this is not a tendency, is scientists say that most part of the climate change is caused by us, by humans. But we know that some part of it is natural, and we don't know what percentage. But you say that it's better if we don't talk about the natural part of this, because it could cause like people to think that it's not our problem and we have nothing to do.
So that does happen. Often when researchers are doing a survey about climate change, they will ask people, do you believe climate change is happening? And then they will ask them, what do you think is the cause of climate change? And the answers are something like, it's mostly human caused, it's a mixture of human caused and natural cause, it's mostly naturally caused. And what you find, and again, this tends to be more political conservatives, they are more likely to think that this is a natural cycle, and it kind of gives them an excuse to kind of disengage. So you're right, that if we put too much emphasis on that aspect of it, it could undermine trying to promote action on it.